Three Iranian warships moved into formation, one ahead, one to the flank, one closing from the rear. In the center of it all, a British aircraft carrier. For a brief moment in the Gulf, the balance of power shifted. But what Iran didn't realize was that the carrier wasn't trapped. It was waiting. The three Iranian warships did not rush. They moved with discipline. One positioned itself ahead of the British aircraft carrier's projected path. Another adjusted speed along the starboard flank. The third remained farther back, closing the gap from the rear. Individually, none of the movements looked aggressive. Together they formed a pattern, and patterns at sea are never accidental. The British aircraft carrier continued forward at a steady pace, its massive gray hull cutting cleanly through the warm Gulf waters. From a distance, it appeared almost indifferent, too large to be threatened, too composed to be pressured. But inside the Carrier Strike Group's operations center, every movement was being tracked. Range updates scrolled across digital displays. Surface contacts, 3-speed coordinated. Formation tightening. No alarms sounded. No urgent commands were shouted. Professional navies did not panic. They calculated. The lead Iranian vessel reduced speed slightly, allowing the flanking ship to drift closer. Their wakes began forming a loose arc around the carrier's outer perimeter. It was subtle, measured, designed to test response without crossing a clear line. On the bridge of the British aircraft carrier, officers watched through high-powered optics. The ships were now clearly visible on the horizon, gray silhouettes against a bright sky. They were not firing. They were not signaling. Music, they were positioning. And positioning sends a message. Below deck, tactical officers reviewed the geometry of the situation. The carrier itself was enormous, but it was not alone. Beyond the immediate visual frame, escort ships maintained distance, layered defense designed to prevent exactly this kind of maneuver. Still, the optics mattered. From above, it would have looked like three smaller warships gradually closing around a floating city of steel. The Iranian ships continued their controlled approach. Distance decreased, 25 km, 20, 18. Close enough to observe detail, close enough to make intent visible. On the Iranian bridges, captains stood calm. This was a show of presence, music, a demonstration of reach. Fora. They understood that confronting a British aircraft carrier was symbolic. The carrier, however, did not adjust course. It did not accelerate. It did not slow down. Its heading remained unchanged. Inside the British Combat Information Center, a senior officer finally spoke. Maintain formation. The words were simple. The meaning was not. The Carrier Strike Group tightened subtly. An escort destroyer shifted 5 degrees. A frigate adjusted position beyond visual range. Helicopter crews remained on standby. Nothing dramatic, just quiet corrections. The Iranian ships were now clearly attempting to compress space. The forward vessel drifted slightly closer to the carrier's projected line of travel. The flanking ship edged inward, narrowing the corridor. For a brief moment, the geometry appeared uncomfortable. 3 ships, 1 carrier. But naval power is not measured by proximity alone. It is measured by awareness. Every radar pulse, every electronic emission, every shift in engine output was being recorded, analyzed, understood. The British carrier had not been surprised. It had been tracking the formation since the first coordinated turn. And while the 3 Iranian warships believed they were shaping the encounter, they were about to discover something critical. Encirclement only works if the center is vulnerable. And this one wasn't. At 16 km, the maneuver was no longer symbolic. It was deliberate. The 3 Iranian warships had compressed the space around the British aircraft carrier into a visible triangle. From above, the formation looked precise. Calculated angles, controlled speed, disciplined spacing. 1 ship ahead, 1 off the starboard side, 1 trailing behind. The carrier remained in the center, but what appeared to be containment was being quietly measured from within. Inside the British Carrier Strike Group's operations room, the tactical display showed far more than 3 surface contacts. It showed vectors, speed adjustments, radar signatures, and electronic emissions layered into a single integrated picture. Every movement had already been anticipated. The lead Iranian vessel adjusted its course 2 degrees to port, subtly narrowing the forward gap. The flanking ship increased speed slightly, tightening lateral distance. The trailing vessel maintained steady pressure from the rear. To an outside observer, it might have looked like the carrier was being boxed in. Inside the British command center, it looked different. It looked predictable. A calm voice broke the silence. Surface contacts maintaining coordinated posture. No weapons radar detected. The commanding officer gave a brief nod. Continue monitoring. No change to course. That decision mattered because turning away would signal pressure. The Greece were less concerned, holding steady projected confidence. On the open deck, flight crews moved with routine precision. Aircraft remained secured but ready. Helicopter rotors were motionless for now. Escort ships positioned beyond immediate visibility adjusted spacing by small degrees that would not be obvious to the Iranian captains. The carrier strike group was not reacting emotionally. It was shaping the geometry of the encounter. At 14 km, the Iranian forward ship appeared to drift closer again. Its bow angled slightly across the carrier's projected path. Not blocking, not officially, but influencing a message without words. On the Iranian bridges, officers watched carefully through optics. They expected some visible response, a course correction, a radio call, a signal flare. Nothing came. The British carrier's heading remained fixed, its speed unchanged, its escorts invisible, but present inside the carrier's tactical center. Electronic support systems continued scanning. The Iranian ship's radar emissions were stable. No targeting locks, no missile system activation. This was pressure, not escalation. And pressure only works if the other side accepts it. At 12 km, the distances felt smaller. Sea space compresses quickly at that range. Visual identification becomes clear. Whole numbers can be seen. Crew movements on deck become visible through high-powered lenses. The Iranian formation was now undeniably close, but something else had shifted. Air assets remained on silent readiness. The encirclement was no longer clean. It was being diluted. The Iranian commanders could sense it. They had moved to shape the space. Yet the center, the British aircraft carrier, showed no instability, no hesitation, no deviation. And in naval confrontations, the first side to hesitate loses leverage. The Gulf waters remained calm. The ships held formation, but control of the encounter was no longer determined by who stood closest. It was determined by who understood the entire picture. And that understanding belonged to the carrier. 10 km, Shintant becomes visible. The three Iranian warships maintained their triangular posture, but the space between them and the British aircraft carrier no longer felt strategic. It felt tense on the Iranian bridges. Officers stood rigid behind optical systems. They could now see the carrier clearly, its vast flight deck stretching like a floating runway, its superstructure towering above the waterline. It was larger than it had seemed at a distance. Calmer, too. There was no visible disorder on deck, no frantic movement, no aircraft scrambling. The carrier continued forward at a constant speed, steady, unapologetic. Inside the British Operations Center, the tactical screen told the wider story. The three surface contacts were tracked with precision, but so were the British escorts, positioned just beyond the immediate visual frame. A Type 45 destroyer maintained offset coverage. A frigate held anti-submarine posture. Air assets were now powered and ready. The encirclement existed, but only on the surface. The commanding officer studied the display for several seconds before speaking. Signal escort alignment. It was a quiet instruction, but within moments, the geometry began to change. The British destroyer adjusted its vector by a few degrees, enough to widen the forward corridor without appearing aggressive. The frigate shifted subtly, closing lateral spacing. The invisible layers tightened. From above, the triangle began to distort. On the Iranian lead, the captain noticed first. Through binoculars, he saw movement. Not dramatic, not confrontational, but deliberate. The British escorts were no longer distant shapes. They were positioning. The flanking Iranian vessel reduced speed slightly, recalculating distance. The trailing ship held steady, but the confidence that had defined the maneuver music was no longer absolute because now the message was clear. The carrier was not boxed in. It was supported. 8 km maintained course. No deviation, no acceleration, just presence. And presence, when backed by layered capability, becomes pressure of its own. Inside the Iranian command spaces, radar operators confirmed additional contacts beyond the carrier. Multiple signatures, multiple vectors. The geometry they had constructed was dissolving. So the triangle no longer contained the center. It was being contained itself. 7 km. At that range, mistakes become dangerous. The Iranian forward vessel eased off its angled posture, reducing the impression of interception. The flanking ship widened spacing by a miserable margin. Not retreating, not conceding, but adjusting. Inside the British command center, no celebration followed, no raised voices, music just confirmation. Surface contacts increasing separation. The commanding officer gave a single nod. Maintain steady. The Gulf waters remained calm, sunlight reflecting off steel hulls that had come closer than either side would publicly acknowledge. 3 warships had attempted to shape the encounter, but shaping is not controlling. Control belongs to the side that never loses awareness. And in this moment, the British carrier had done exactly that. Music it had not escaped, it had not reacted, it absorbed the maneuver and quietly reversed it. The encirclement lasted minutes. The message would last much longer. 6 kilometers. At that range, there was no room for miscalculation. The 3 Iranian warships remained visible in full detail. Now, whole numbers clear. Deck crews moving in controlled routines, optics fixed firmly on the British carrier. The triangle that had once appeared tight was no longer precise. Small gaps had opened, subtle but undeniable. Inside the British carrier strike group, no dramatic shift occurred. The carrier continued on its original heading, a massive, steady presence that refused to acknowledge pressure. Its escorts held layered positions, not aggressive, not advancing, simply aligned. That alignment changed everything. On the Iranian lead, the captain lowered his binoculars slowly. He had seen the escort destroyer adjust. He had seen the distant silhouette of another British vessel on the edge of visibility. The carrier had never been alone. The flanking Iranian ship increased separation by a fraction, widening the lateral corridor. The trailing vessel music reduced speed slightly, allowing distance to stretch. No radio exchange was broadcast publicly. No official statement was made. But on the water, the shift was visible. 5 km, close enough to feel scale. The British carrier did not slow. It did not accelerate. It did not turn. That consistency forced a decision because the only way to maintain a box at that range would have required further compression, and further compression risked misinterpretation. Professional navies understand lines that must not be crossed. Inside the British operations center, the atmosphere remained measured. Contacts widening formation. The commanding officer's response was immediate. Hold steady. There was no pursuit, no need. The Iranian formation gradually opened, reshaping into parallel transit rather than encirclement. The forward vessel drifted clear of the carrier's path. The flanking ship eased outward. The trailing ship maintained distance rather than pressure. The triangle dissolved. 4 km out, the ships were no longer confronting. They were coexisting. Sunlight reflected across calm Ball waters as steel hulls passed within visible proximity, closer than either side would describe in official language. The British carrier moved through the gap without ceremony. No sirens, no fighter launch, no escalation, just forward motion. And forward motion in moments like this defines authority. On the Iranian-British, the message was understood. The maneuver had tested resolve. The response had demonstrated depth. The carrier had not needed to break the encirclement. It had simply endured it and outlasted it. As distance slowly increased, the tension that had compressed the space between the ships began to fade. But one reality remained. 3 warships had attempted to box in a British aircraft carrier. They had closed the space, they had shaped the geometry. Yet in the end, they had not controlled it. And at sea, control is everything.